Okay, let's talk about classification. So, scientists classify all creatures that are alive, right? We have this whole classification scheme, and it's actually known as systematics, okay? So, we actually try to sort out the relationships, the evolutionary relationships between every creature on the planet, even those that are extinct, which all of these are extinct, I think, for the most part. So we've got Anomalocharus up here, like how is that related to the trilobites, the Linnaeus, things like that. And we trace them back to common ancestry, okay? So we're going to look a little bit at kind of how we do that and what our system currently is. And we mentioned it earlier before in a different lecture, but let's just take an example here. It's a pretty cool looking thing, isn't it? What do you think that is? It's definitely a spider, yep. If I turn one of these down, is it too much? Is it too dark? I'll crack one of these windows. It'll give us a little bit of light, and we can still have. There we are. Yeah, pretty cool looking, isn't it? So, in terms of classification, when you discover a new organism, you get to name it. Now, there's some agreed upon conventions. Okay, what language do we use to name creatures? Latin. Yep, every name is in Latin, and there's some really good reasons for that, particularly because Latin is a dead language. So by dead language, that means that we're not developing any new Latin words. So it's not changing, which means that if we assign something a name, like we don't have to worry about the usage of that changing in some way, right? Because think about all the new words that keep cropping up in the English language. Like what are some of the recent ones? How about yeet? You guys hear people say that? Right? Totally recent word, right? New word in the language. Or like cool. And my generation grew up saying that. It didn't mean that originally. It meant like being cool, not like being cool. So like the meanings change. But in Latin that doesn't happen. In fact, a lot of Latin words, we don't even know how to pronounce them because nobody's around that can pronounce them anymore. Right? Okay, if you need to go to the bathroom and good, okay, but you got to keep your mask up if you're in this room, okay? So this spider, its common name is called the sorting hat spider. See it? Any Harry Potter fans? Come on, you can see it, right? It's pretty cool, isn't it? It really looks like the sorting hat. So the person who discovered this got to name the spider. Now that's not its scientific name, that's its common name. So common names are useful too, but in, say, Germany, the common name for that spider, if it's sorting hat, is not going to be sorting hat. It's going to be German, right? It'll be something that German people can speak and remember and easily talk about. Right? Because it's difficult sometimes to use scientific names unless you're a scientist and used to them. Its actual scientific name, not sure if I can even pronounce this, Aravixia gryffindori. I bet you can guess where the second part of that name came from, can't you? Right? Now, the scientist that chose this name got to pick this second part of the name here. The scientist did not get to pick the first part of the name. That was determined by our classification system. Now, sometimes a new species of spider is found that's so different from every other spider that we do get to pick a genus name. Like we need a whole new branch to describe it. But oftentimes, there's already a group of spiders, whatever this genus is here, and we're just added a new one to that group. Okay, we're saying it's related to these guys here. But its specific name, its most specific name, is Gryffindori. So kind of neat how that's pulled off. And a lot of the time, people will name new creatures that they discover after somebody who's famous, or presidents oftentimes get things named after them. I think Obama's got a number of things named after him. Like some of them are like funny little ants and spiders and things like that. But scientists are quirky, and they like to do stuff like that. It's kind of fun. Anyway, let's look at the actual classification of this guy. So if we break this down in terms of our classification system, I'm going to do this a number of times because I want you to get used to it, okay? The domain is the very top level. And you don't have to write this down. I'll give you a spot where I've got it all written down for you. The domain is eukarya. Are you a eukaryote? Yes, you are. Your cells have a nucleus. They're complex. You are a eukaryote. Spiders are eukaryotes too. So that's its top level. Are there a lot of things in the domain eukarya? Yeah, if people are in there, and spiders are in there, and ants are in there, and birds are in there, and snakes are in there, there's a lot of things in eukarya. Okay? We step down and we lose some things. Because right now, we're dropping down to the kingdom Animalia. Are you in the kingdom Animalia? Yep, but a plant's not, and a plant's a eukaryote. So plants were still up here with the eukaryotes. Now we've classified it even more finely. Now it's in the kingdom Animalia. It's definitely an animal. Then we drop down into the phylum Arthropoda. So it's an arthropod. Okay? So these are creatures, among other things, who have jointed legs. Okay, they have body segments, they have jointed legs. We don't fall into the phylum Arthropoda. So we're specifically talking about mostly things that are kind of like insect-looking things, crustaceans, stuff like that. Okay, and spiders fall in there. Then we drop into the class Arachnida. Now, I know you've heard arachnids before, and most of us think spider, like arachnophobia, like fear of spiders. But there's actually a whole slew of things that are in this group, not just spiders. We've got ticks, mites, scorpions. Those are all part of the class Arachnida. They're all arachnids. Weird, isn't it? If we drop down further, we see that this thing is specifically a spider. So its order, the Araneae, is spiders. Okay, so now we're in the spider grouping. We've ditched ticks, mites, scorpions, right? Everything else up above that. Now we're going to drop down one more, okay, into a specific family. And this is the scientific name for the family of orb weavers, which is spiders that weave like these orb webs. Okay? In fact, not all of them do, but so many of them do that we have this grouping, and that's what we call them, right? So what's really important is that their DNA is related. They're similar in terms of DNA, not necessarily that they have the same characteristics or look the same. But usually if something's DNA is related, they look pretty similar, right? So it works out most of the time. Finally, we drop down into its genus, okay, which is much more specific than anything else up here, okay? And there are other spiders that are going to fall into the same genus. Some may look just like it, some may not look like it all, but they're similar genetically, okay? And then finally, the most specific we can get is to lump the genus and the species together, the Gryffindori, and now we have a scientific name. Ta-da! So that is like the final resolution of all this. Do you see how the groupings work? So at the very top, we include the most stuff. And as we get further down the list, we get less and less stuff that falls in the group until finally we're at just one solitary thing. There is only one thing on the planet that's called Aerovixia Gryffindori, and it's that particular spider. So every scientist knows what you're talking about. But if you're hanging out talking to your friends, not that you probably talk to your friends about spiders, I mean I do, but you might say, oh yeah, the sorting hat spider, because I'm not going to remember that, not unless I study spiders. I mean, there's some scientific names that I remember all the time just because they're unique and like I'm used to saying them, but most of the time, I know the common names, but I could look the scientific name up pretty quick, right? So it's useful for scientists to do this. Let's do another example. Here's a plant. Anybody, what kind of plant? Is that? Yeah, the common dandelion, okay? Now the common dandelion, let's break down its classification, okay? Let's break down its classification. So its scientific name is actually Taraxacum officinale. And the Weber is just the guy who named it. And so sometimes we tack the name on there, like you'll see that sometimes if you're like on Wikipedia or some of the other sites that give you a classification breakdown. You'll see a little funny name tacked onto the outside. It's just the person who named it, who discovered it. Okay? He probably didn't really discover the dandelion. Everybody's known about dandelion forever, right? But this is the person that described it in the book and got to name it. So I think officinale in Latin means common. I'm pretty sure that's what that means. Like it's a very common thing. And I'm not sure what the genus name means, but there'll be other things in the genus. So let's see if we can actually do a breakdown here. There's my dandelion. What would the top level be? Where would it fall? What would its domain be? What do you think? Eukarya. Good. Good. And after eukarya, it would fall into what kingdom? It's a what? It's a plant. Awesome. If you can get that far, I'm like super happy. And it's going to make the rest of the year easy. Here's the whole breakdown. And I added some extra things up here. No, actually I didn't. I'll do that on another slide. There's something different up here that you didn't see on the last one though. So we go domain, kingdom, plantae, division, Magnolia phyta, So, do you see the difference there? What was the last one? Instead of division, we had what?
Phylum.
We had phylum. So, here's a quirk. It's just a funny quirk. Botanists don't use the word phylum. They actually refer to plants in terms of something called divisions, but it's the same level. Okay, so you could think of divisions and phylum on the same level. It's just a different word we use when we're talking about plants. Okay, so don't get confused by that. We won't do that to you in here. We'll probably just use the phylum word. And then we drop down to class. Okay, it's in the dicotyledon class. Has to do with its seeds. Its order is Astrales, which refers to all the aster plants that have aster-like flowers. I've heard the aster before. And it finally drops into the family Asteraceae, which is specifically the aster family. And then we have the genus, and we put that together with the species. And we have the common dandelion. Ta-da. Pretty simple stuff. Let's do another one. What's that?
Mole rat?
Yeah, that's right. That's a naked mole rat. That's a rufous. So, if we drop through rufous here, we'll find that rufous is in the domain Eukarya. It's a eukaryote, just like us, just like plants. Phylum, or kingdom Animalia. You already knew it was an animal, I'm sure. Its phylum is Chordata. So chordates are things that have notochords, and in most of them, it turns into a backbone. Okay, so not all chordates actually have a backbone. I probably shouldn't have written it like that, but they do have a notochord. Okay. Then we fall into the class Mammalia. Okay, so it's a mammal. It's warm-blooded. It's hairy. Well, there are some hairs on there. You can see a few there, right? Even though it's mostly naked. Produces milk, right? These are all animals that do this. Its order is Rodentia, which is the rodents. And usually rodents have things like self-sharpening teeth that keep growing, and they have to gnaw stuff to keep their teeth kind of trimmed up. Otherwise, their teeth would just grow. Its family is the family that describes mole rats and sand rats. So there's a whole group of these different things that are in the same family. And then its genus and its species give us its scientific name, which is the naked mole rat in common speech. Nobody wants to say that, though, most of the time when they're talking. Nobody know what you're talking about, right? But if you had to write a paper or discuss something with other scientists, they're not necessarily going to know what a naked mole rat is, especially if they're from another country, right? So there's old Rufus. Okay, here's some stuff. So let's start with Aristotle. How did this whole classification system get started? Well, Aristotle, which was a philosopher, came up with sort of our first system. He had two main groups. He said there's plants and there's animals. Basically, he was saying there's stuff with like liquidy blood, and then there's this other stuff. Like it was separating it out like that. In fact, some of these early systems classified like rocks and minerals as part of it as well. They had their own groups. So you can see like early people trying to struggle, like how do we categorize all this stuff that we see around ourselves? Okay? So he had plants and animals, and then he divided those up into characteristics and then where they lived. Do you think where organisms live has that much to do with like how closely related they really are? You think it does? Doesn't. It really doesn't. I mean, it can, but it really doesn't. So he's just striving for the best system he can come up with without any knowledge of genetics or anything like that, right? So this is not really going to show the evolutionary history of creatures very well. Occasionally it's going to hit the mark, but a lot of the time it's going to be wrong, right? Lumping all plants together is absolutely right, like they're a group, right? But say, I don't know what Aristotle would have done, like lumping snails in with mold because they like to live in the same wet, dark, damp places doesn't really work out, right? They're not really closely related to mold. Okay? Actually, you probably would have lumped mold in with plants, which would have been really wrong, right? So Aristotle got us started. And next comes this guy, and this guy's the most famous guy we'll talk about. Jot down Carl's name up here. Carolus Linnaeus. He developed a system called binomial nomenclature, which is a word you'll want to put down. It's our two-name system. Okay? So bi means two. Like nomenclature means like naming system. So we have this system where we provide every creature on the planet with two names. That's the bi part. What's the first name called? Starts with the G?
Genus.
Genus, and then the species. So you have a genus and species, Every plant out there has a genus and species. Every animal, every bacteria, every archaean, they all have a genus and species. Okay? Now, he didn't get it perfectly right, but he basically set up our system. He set up our system of using these two words to describe everything. And we still use this today. So it's a big dealio. But a lot of the time he was basing similarities off of the structure. So what the organisms looked like. So in his system, it was totally right to put bats with birds. Are bats related to birds? Heck no. Bats are mammals. They're hairy, they have mammary glands, like they're mammals, right? Warm-blooded. So bats are not birds. Very, very different than birds. But they have similar characteristics. Right? Today it's easy, it's obvious to us today, especially with our modern knowledge of genetics. So get down binomial nomenclature. It's the genus and species. We still use it today. And get down old Carl's name there. Those are the important pieces. Right? All right, we'll do another one here. Everybody got that? I'll give you a second. Right. You don't have to put it all down, but just get Carl's name down. You need to know who Linnaeus was. Okay? And you need to know what binomial nomenclature is. Those are the big words. Okay, lots of things still actually bear his name. Like, he's that famous. He wrote so many papers on this, like compiled like leaves and leaves and pages of stuff, that lots of things bear his name. Okay, and you'll see his name tacked on to the end of lots of things, like this Necrophilia americana, which is a carrion beetle. You guys ever seen these? They're pretty neat. You probably don't want to spend a lot of time around dead, rotting things, but if you happen to see a deer on the side of the road that's all bloated and kind of stinky, if you flipped it over, underneath of it would be loads of these beetles eating it. Because the name essentially means lovers of dead stuff, and these things love dead, rotting stuff, and they eat it. So they're called carrion beetles in their common name. Carrion meaning like dead, rotten meat. A lot of things have Carl's name, like that. Here's us. Let's take a look here. We are Kingdom Animalia, okay? And I put a bunch of other stuff up here that we're not going to need to know, so don't try and write all this down. You're doing great if you know that we're in the animal kingdom. I'm super happy if you can go, yeah, humans are animals, we're not plants. Okay, super happy about that. So we're in the animal kingdom. We're in the phylum Chordata. Okay, so we have a notochord, and when we're young, and that notochord turns into our backbone, so our subphylum is actually vertebrata. So I put subphylum on here. There's classifications in between a lot of these. I just wanted you to see it. We won't ever ask you subphylums, okay? Its class is Mammalia, so we're the mammals. Our subclass, our infraclass, and finally our order. Our order is primate. We are primates. There's a whole bunch of things that are primates, not just us. Okay? As we go further down, we get ourselves down into the family. So we go through the suborder, the superfamily, and finally the family, Hominidae, which is the group of things we call hominids. And we're not the only one. I hate to break it to you. We are, however, the only Homo sapiens. There are other things that are Homo something else. They have the same genus as us. None of them are still alive. Okay, they're extinct. But we are the only group of things that are sapiens. Okay, so that's our species, as close as you can get. Let's look at one of these other creatures. Okay? Recognize this guy? This is Homo neanderthalensis. Homo places this feller in the same genus as us. We're in the same genus. So that means we're really pretty similar. In every other, if we're in the same genus, then everything above this has to be the same, doesn't it? You see that? If you land in the same genus, you're the same all the way up to the top. We're not the same species. However, biology's quirky. And for every rule that I give you, there's sort of like a a twisting of the rules and a bending of the rules. In biology, this is often the case. And as we know now through studying Neanderthal DNA, if you have any European descent in you at all, you also have Neanderthal DNA in your body. You carry some Neanderthal DNA. Now, how could that be if we're separate species? What had to happen way back in time? What had to happen? How do you get DNA? Mating. So somewhere back along the way, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens mated. We've got genetic evidence for this. In fact, we have evidence through the fossils as well of them being in similar locations. So it's kind of interesting. But if you have any European descent, you do have some Neanderthal DNA. In fact, we've gone as far as to figure out some of the actual genes that they conferred to us, like what those genes are. Really interesting stuff. Super interesting stuff. So we aren't the only ones. Okay, what's in a name? So the word taxonomy just refers to the study of classification. Scientific names like Homo habilis, for instance, contain two parts, the genus and the species, or sometimes it's called the specific epithet. Okay? It's just the specific name of the critter. And they're always Latin, like I said, because Latin's a dead language. But that makes it nice because things don't change. Like, we don't have to worry about the meaning of a word changing or a word evolving. The English language is constantly evolving. We're constantly adding new words. We're constantly changing the meaning of stuff. Just because we feel like it, right? Just because it's kind of fun to mess with your words a little bit. So that doesn't happen in Latin because nobody speaks Latin anymore. Unless you take a class in Latin, like, you're not going to go someplace in the world and find like a whole group of people that only speak Latin. Okay? You might find people who can understand it, but they're going to be few and far between. So common names, though, like dandelion, are super easy to remember, right? I'm not going to call that thing by T officinale. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to remember it most of the time. But I know what a dandelion is, and you know what a dandelion is. So it's good enough, okay? So let's take a look here at some of these creatures that are actually not that closely related, but look pretty similar. Look at how similar all these things look. And this is in, I believe, German, although I don't speak German. Look at these groupings. Look at they all look like little mice, right? I think that what these refer to, this is, of course, a gerbil. So these are probably a family of things that are all considered gerbils. Notice that some of them have gerbilis as their genus. Okay, they have different species names. Okay, so they're really similar in terms of that. We look down here and we've got hamsters, and they've got a different genus. Some of them have similar genera. We drop down. These are, I think, called jumping mice in German. Springmaus, probably jumping mouse. I think those are the same as our jumping mice, or kangaroo mice, I think we call them. So, look at that, kangaroo feet. Okay? And of course, they have different genera that they're involved in. Okay? And those show us their actual genetic relationships. Down below, we have the Echtmaus. I think that's like common mouse or something along those lines. Anybody speak German? Regular mouse, common, typical mouse, something like that. And then these guys have scientific names as well. And even though they look really similar, like, some of them are very different genetically. Like, they're not necessarily related closely together. Okay, let's take a look here. Oh, that's a little hard to see. About why we classify things. It lets us see the relationships. Turn this down a bit. So, anybody recognize this critter? We talked about it the other day. Starts with an A. This is Archaeopteryx. Archaeopteryx is no longer with us. Archaeopteryx is an ancient fossil. Okay, and there's lots of Archaeopteryx fossils, but it's very unique in that it's got a lot of characteristics that are kind of both reptile and both bird. It's like a reptile bird. And it's in the fossil record. We've got great preservation of its feathers. It had these long tail feathers. Okay, it had vertebrae running through its body, so it was definitely a vertebrate. So you see how we could classify something that's ancient, something that's only a fossil? We have these characteristics that we know are similar through DNA testing. We can't get this thing's DNA. but we can look at its characteristics and go, where does it fall in the tree of life based on what things we know it has for certain. We know it's got feathers, right? We know mammals don't have feathers. We know it's got vertebrae, it's got a backbone. We know that birds do as well. So see how we're like moving this over? But we also know it's got things like a reptile claw out the end of its wing. It's got a toothed beak, as did some dinosaurs. So now we're kind of classifying this thing, we're sorting it out, we're realizing that it's like a kind of like a dinosaur bird looking thing. Right? So we draw these lines and we try to match this stuff up based on characteristics. And we don't always get it right. I mean, sometimes we have to revise what we've found. As soon as a new fossil gets discovered, we come up with something new. Here's our current classification of all Archaeopteryx. Okay? Its genus and its species, its scientific name, is Archaeopteryx lithographica. Now, why did they give it a species, even though it's the only one they ever found? Because they're probably going to find others, right, that are related, that are also Archaeopteryx, but they're slightly different enough that we want to give them a different species. Okay, so to have a scientific name, you have to have both words. Okay, so it's genus and species. It's an animal. It's definitely a chordate. We classify it in aves, which is the birds. Okay, its order and its family don't mean a whole lot to us because they're all ancient. So it's actually got its own order and its own family. So it's its own. It's really different from everything else by the level of order. There's really nothing else that it's similar to. And of course, we found other fossils now that we're kind of fleshing out the history of birds as we go. Here's an example of some different mammals. Let's take a look here. If they're a mammal, they're all kingdom Animalia. If they're a mammal, they're all phylum Chordata. Okay? If they're a class, or if they're a mammal, they're all class Mammalia. That's where the word comes from. It's the class name. Now at the level of order, we've got some differences. Let's look down at the common names. A blue whale, a ferret, and a domestic cat. They are the same all the way down to class Mammalia. Okay? When we hit order, suddenly they're different. But the ferret and the cat are similar. Okay? As we go down further, we hit family. All their families are different. Okay? We hit genus, all their genera are different. Genera is just plural for genus. Species, every species better be different. Do you notice how they abbreviated the genus there? You don't ever see a species written just solitary. If you're writing something scientific or writing this down, you would never just write the species name per se. You'd always at least abbreviate the genus. Okay, because that's the full name. Okay. So tell me this. Which two of those creatures up there are most closely related? What do you got? Yeah, do you guys see how obvious it is? The cat and the ferret are the most closely related because they're the same all the way down to the order level. They don't differ till we get down here to the family. The whales are much more different than these two. And this is genetically, this is physically, like these characteristics represent branches on the tree. Okay, and that's how our classification system works. Okay, this is the one I want you to jot down. Okay, this is the whole set of levels that you're going to need to know for class. We have domain, which is the topmost level. So there are very few domains, but everything, a single domain contains so much stuff, it's ridiculous. Okay? There's really only 3 domains. And there's some debate about this too. Maybe we'll get into it a little bit. Kingdoms. After you drop down from domain, you drop into kingdoms. Okay. There's 6 kingdoms. These are things like plant and animal, right? These are our kingdoms. For those funky bacteria, their kingdom name is the same as their domain name sometimes. Then we drop down to phylum. Well, there's lots of phylums. I'm not going to try and put any up there. There's just lots of them. You don't have to write that down. So we're not going to be having you memorize phylums, okay? Memorizing the different phyla is kind of crazy. There's so many of them. But you can remember the 6 kingdoms and the 3 domains, which I'll put up for you here in a second. As we go down, there's even more. There's even more orders. There's even more families. There's even more genera. And finally, there's just a ridiculous number of species on our planet. right? You don't have to remember all this. I'm going to give you the 3 domains in the 6 kingdoms. And you can write that down here in a second. Okay. What do we call this again? What's the genus and species called? The starts with an S. Close, real close. Scientific name, yep. The genus and the species together is our description of the creature. Okay. You see how that's as specific as we can get. If you put those 2 together, there's only one of it, whatever it is. Okay. Homo sapiens. There's only one human. Homo sapiens. Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And if we were, go. Okay. I don't know why that's circled, but there you go. All right, let's take a look here. You need to have a way to kind of remember this, but since I'm letting you use your notes on the test, it's not such a big deal. When I was in high school, we had to remember this. And my teacher taught me the way to remember kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, okay, was kings play chess on fine green sand. That's how I always remember it. That's how I passed my biology test. Kings play chess on fine green sand. What am I missing? I'm missing domain. So guess what? When I was in high school, we didn't have domains. Scientists were discussing it and saying we really need something above kingdom to describe, because they had just discovered archaea. They had just figured out that the bacteria weren't just one group, and they were figuring this out. Like, I remember hearing about it, and my biology teacher telling us, hey, this is not set in stone, it's going to change. We already know it's not quite right. It's going to change as soon as scientists make a decision as to how it should go. And sure enough, it did. Right now we have domains. So I had to change that to dumb kings play chess on fine green sand. That's how I remember it. Right? But domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. This is the one Mr. Linnaeus uses. This came from him. Dr. King Philip comes over for good spaghetti. And you can see, just like before, if we start with eukaryota, domain eukarya, we drop down to kingdom animalia. Look at how the number of different creatures reduces. It keeps reducing all the way down till we hit species, and then you just got one, like Ursus americanus, the black bear, the American black bear. Okay. If you go up from there, though, Ursus includes all kinds of stuff, right? Ursidae includes everything from panda bears to, I don't know, what else is in there? Lots of stuff, right? Kodiaks and everything else that you might call a bear. Some things you probably wouldn't recognize as a bear. So, in terms of systematics, which is just kind of another name for taxonomy, there are 3 domains, and jot them down: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. 2 of those are not eukaryotes, right? The 2 bacterial domains, the bacteria and archaeans, are prokaryotes. Everybody's going to remember that. The 6 kingdoms are archaea, bacteria. They're the same as their domains, aren't they? So we haven't quite sorted out how to classify them anymore in depth. And maybe that'll happen. And then the rest of these kingdoms all belong to the eukaryotes. So the animals, the plants, the produce, the fungi, those are all part of the eukaryotes. Sometimes you see people say, the 4 kingdoms, but what they're referring to is the 4 eukaryotic kingdoms. And we really should include the domain, the other 2 domains, the bacteria and the archaeans. So when you look at this here, we kind of had this on the last slide, but there are lots of creatures that have fallen a similar domain. Okay, you pick a phylum, and there's lots of creatures that fall in that phylum. And as we go down the list, right, there's less and less till you get very specific. Now this is talking about how many there are on Earth, so you could look at that in 1 or 2 ways. So it's a little confusing sometimes when we ask the questions, There's millions of different species, but a single species name is specific to just one creature. So how do we come up with all this? I put this up here, And you may not find it interesting, but I do pretty extremely find it interesting. I'm going to tell you right now that we know that some of this stuff is wrong. Do you remember when we talked about protists? We know protists ain't a group. We know that we just took a bunch of critters and lumped them into a group because we didn't know what to do with them. We know for a fact we're going to start sorting them out, and they're going to go into different things, maybe totally new kingdoms. Do we know they're all eukaryotes? Yes. But do we know they all should be in different kingdoms? Probably. Probably there are going to be some other kingdoms that are going to come about, and we're going to change all this. It's normal, okay? Another thing that we know, and one of the reasons we like to study this, is not so much just because scientists like to classify things. They probably do. I like to classify things. But because we want to know, like, how did this stuff come about? How did these characteristics arise? What branch from what? Who's related to who? Like, that's the real nitty-gritty behind systematics and behind taxonomy, like relationships. So let me throw this at you, and this is nothing you need to know for the test or anything like that. It's just, I find it intriguing. Currently in science, in taxonomy, there is a debate. There are two competing hypotheses, as oftentimes happens in science. One hypothesis is called the three domains hypothesis. It's what we give you in the textbook. We teach you three domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. The other hypothesis is called the archaeal host hypothesis, or the two-domain hypothesis. So check this out. And there's a lot of debate over this. And here's the deal. There's evidence both ways. And both of these two hypotheses mostly explain the available evidence. What will be the true hypothesis? What will eventually become the theory that we accept scientifically? Nobody knows yet. Right? Maybe new discoveries are going to change it. Or as of right now, there's no way to fully decide between the two hypotheses. They both do a pretty decent job of explaining things. A lot of scientists are leaning towards this archaeal host hypothesis, which is different than what you just learned up here. So I said you don't have to remember this. So here's how it plays out really in terms of relationships. Okay? What domain are all of you? You're kingdom Animalia, but what domain? Starts with an E. Eukaryotes. You're eukarya. Okay? Which means you ain't a bacteria and you're not an archaea. But how are you related to them? Because if we travel back far enough through time, we'll reach a last universal common ancestor somewhere back there. So looking at the tree, scientists are trying to sort this out. In our current situation, what we have is a branching tree from a common ancestor here. This is the three-domain hypothesis. It branches off one direction for bacteria. They're so different from everything else. And another branch branches off, and there's a common ancestor shared between eukaryotes and archaea. In other words, we have a relationship with archaeas. In other words, they're closer to us than the bacteria are. Now we know that. Okay, and we're hypothesizing there's a common ancestor there somewhere back in time where the branches split. The problem is this doesn't explain all the evidence, and the evidence is extremely molecular and complex, but it has to do with the proteins that are formed inside organisms that are eukaryotes and things that are bacteria versus things that are archaeas. And it has to do with the types of cell membranes that they have. Because what we're asking really is how in the heck did the nucleus develop? So you see, it looks like just some classification mumbo jumbo, but really the question's deep. How did the nucleus come about? How did the complex cell develop when all this stuff's very basic? In the archaeal hypothesis over here, the idea is that a branch of the archaeans, one of the branches of the archaeans actually split off to become the eukaryotes. Which, if that's the case, there's no longer three domains. And all of the eukaryotes are technically part of the archaea domain, if that's true. But like I said, there's a lot of debate about this. It's like it's very hard to sort out. We need more evidence. We need more knowledge about what some of these creatures are. And to make it even more complex, which we haven't talked about this yet, way back in time when we were dealing with microscopic stuff, there was something called lateral gene flow. So, in other words, something didn't have to mate with something else to provide it with its DNA. And we have great evidence that this has occurred, and that this is how certain things arose. In other words, one bacteria gobbled up another bacteria, And rather than digesting it, it continued to live inside of it symbiotically. And we created a more complex creature. That's weird stuff. There is tremendous amounts of evidence for this. Okay, it's called endosymbiont theory. And then so the question becomes, who gobbled who? Who was living together symbiotically, and how did that give us more complex cells? Did a bacteria gobble a bacteria? In some instances, we know for sure that happened. And I could point them out if you wanted to get technical. Did an archaea gobble a bacteria that had gobbled another bacteria? So there's all kinds of complexity here, and sorting it out is kind of the fun of science, in a way. Okay, so we're going to close that out there. There we go.